We are working closely with DVSA since 2015, supporting their exciting and I would say amazing digital-enabled business transformation journey and to the path of the Enterprise Service Management Initiative. Given that globally 70% of existing digital business initiatives fail due to the lack of skills, the capability, and the know-how, I believe that this is one of the few great stories, success stories, that you will hear. Today we will do a 30-minute presentation and we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. So, I now give it to James.
Hi, good afternoon everybody. Before I get into our transformation journey, I'll just set the scene a bit about who DVSA are. Our purpose in Britain is to keep people safe, keep everyone safe on Britain's roads. And the vision that we've laid out is that we want safer drivers, safer vehicles, and safer journeys. And we pretty much touch everyone in Britain who uses our roads. And our strategy, we've broken it down into 3 areas. We look at it across 3 different areas. We think about a lifetime of safe driving for people, helping people keep their vehicles safe to drive, and protecting people from unsafe vehicles and drivers. And the way we do that is by the driving and theory test, by national MOT test, which is the annual test of safety on your car and similar for heavy vehicles, and enforcement against people who don't follow the standards. And we depend on our people, our infrastructure, and our relationships. And the number of interactions people have with DVSA across the country, we have around 47 million interactions. A lot of those are in the annual test, where there's 42 million tests per year. But on the driving test side, we have 2.5 million theory tests and 1.6 million driving tests a year. And we have upwards of 1 million MOTs on heavy vehicles. And then we also regulate operators and provide the operator licenses for operators and also public service vehicles. So thinking about our digital transformation journey, we were a merger of 2 government agencies a few years ago. One of those agencies was responsible for drivers and one for vehicles, and we came together. And both those agencies were outsourced to IT suppliers on long-term outsource contracts that were 10 years plus. And therefore, the IT organisation was very much a contract management organisation and would very much take orders from the business and pass those to the outsource providers and then deliver the results through those outsource providers. And they hosted the infrastructure, they ran the help desks, they pretty much ran the entire IT estate. And there was a fairly heavy prescriptive governance to get things done. And there was a waterfall style approach to delivery.
I think if I can add, James, to that, is typically in the past, if we wanted to make a change to one of our services, it could take upwards of 6 months from the idea to that. So if you were at the receiving end of our services, we seem to be very slow in making that change.
And in 2012, we recognised the need that we wanted to do something different and we wanted to change. And as these contracts were coming naturally to an end, we didn't want to go out with the same types of contracts. And so we started a transformation journey, and we picked one of those services, which was a national MOT service, so the annual check that your car is safe to drive on Britain's roads. And we started to think about how could we do that in a different way. It was a turnkey outsourced solution to a provider. They did everything on that service. And starting in 2012, we started to build a service that we could host ourselves internally to DBSA and start to build our own technology capability. I joined in 2015 when that project had been running for a few years, but it was really at the point where we needed to start to build that digital expertise and that cultural shift. So what we looked for as we moved through was that cultural shift and change. And we looked at how we would host the technology, and we did a review of the cloud providers at the time, and AWS came out as the provider that we were going to use to host this service in production. And it was quite pioneering because we were the first government agency in the UK to host at scale on AWS. So we worked closely with them going through the assurance process for security of running that service. And we also pioneered looking at how we were going to run it in an agile way, how we were going to challenge the business model, how we were going to do many releases and go to a backlog-based approach for our products. And since then, we've now moved to 10 products across the agency. All of those products now have backlogs, and all our change comes off those backlogs. And we built ourselves an Agile Delivery Centre, and we put in specialist Agile governance processes. So the journey so far, as I say, I joined back in 2015, and we were then at that point starting to need to build that digital capability internally and start to enable the organisation beyond the technology teams out into the broader business. The MOT went live as an MVP in September of 2015. Into 2016, we reorganised the digital services and technology team around what we could see coming. As we wanted to transform our other main services, we wanted to have a team that we could scale to meet that demand. DVSA also reorganised through that period, and the digital and technology team took on full responsibility for delivery of the agency's portfolio of technology, but also of business change. And then into 2017, after completing the initial discoveries for the next transformations, we put in an Agile Delivery Partners Framework. And then we focused on digital data and technology strategy, which supported the main DBSA strategy, and continued with that Agile governance journey. So thinking about DBSA strategy, the DBSA strategy was published earlier this year. It took into account several things in government which are critical to our success. And it focused on those three main elements: that helping people through a lifetime of safe driving, helping you keep your vehicle safe to drive, and protecting you from unsafe drivers and vehicles. And there are several elements in that strategy to make it successful. For example, the estate strategy and the commercial strategy. But the bit we're focusing on today is in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the data, digital and technology strategy. And the focus of that strategy was three elements. One, we said we would transform our customer services, our main frontline services, so our driver services, our vehicle testing services, and our enforcement and compliance services. And all those were under these older outsource contracts. And we understood that we needed to enable our staff and our teams. We've got a highly mobile workforce across the country. We've got 4,500 people in the agency, and they're spread all over the country, from doing driving tests to doing roadside enforcement. And it was clear that we needed to enable them with mobile technology and enable such a distributed organisation to be able to collaborate effectively and to be able to tap into our data. So our data is a big untapped resource of what we can do to help our teams focus better with their decision making. And finally, we said that we'd do this delivery in a way that was the most efficient and reliable for the agency. And we'd be flexible about how we delivered. So we wouldn't say that everything was agile, and we wouldn't say that everything was waterfall. We would allow some flexibility to be able to blend that across our deliveries. And we defined 6 principles of change. It was really key to us that we put users at the heart of what we did. We recognise that data is a public asset, and we make that public whenever we can. That we use reusable components and open standards. And it's important that we make things clear and simple. So all the services we're delivering, whether if it's on the internet straight out to customers, it's easy to use. Ongoing engagement with the business and transparent contracting. But what we also wanted to do is minimise building, so minimise building software. So as we go through this process, everything we're about is about reuse, it's about renting, it's about buying, and only if all of those fail do we want to actually write code.
So thank you, James. So moving on to how we approach our digital services. One of the key things, and we spend a lot of time on this, we're working out why we're doing the service, really getting the teams and the businesses and what the mission is around that, the vision. We spend time with the service owner, really developing a vision that they own. We make sure when they've got that vision, they present that back to the business, so there's complete buy-in across the whole of the organisation around that vision. Then what we will do then is make clear that there are strategic objectives that everybody can buy into. Moving on, when we've got the why settled, is how we're going to run the service. So clearly we introduce new governance ways of working, the structures are different, and the operating model for the new services is distinctly different to the old type of ways of working. What we try to do when we're designing the new services and that end-to-end is make sure that the approvals process is very transparent, that there's no unnecessary delay in those services, and equally building the trust of the organisation so that the correct amount of oversight of the project is there, but it doesn't get in the way of delivery. Now, when we've got the end-to-end operating model settled, I think one of the most valuable things, and if there's a takeaway from this, is then in developing the service catalogue and really mapping out what that service is. One of the things that we learned, particularly as James said, is moving from big legacy contracts where most of the solution provided to us was turnkey, what I describe as a black box. As we unwrap that and we really define what the service is, one, we discover things that we weren't clear how they worked. So really mapping through that is a really valuable process. Defining what the key metrics are, the KPIs for that is really important. But you have to do that with the team and take the team through the process. What you have to avoid is people assuming that they know exactly what the service is and the details behind that. In the few services that we did in the early days, we made one or two assumptions. We paid a little bit of a price for that. We discovered as we went live that we hadn't really done the detail. So when Emergn came on board, particularly with MOT, and we really mapped out in detail what that service is and really decided how we'd run it, we discovered that data, which we'll speak about a little bit in this, was one of the key services that we're providing and of extreme volume and probably more valuable than we appreciated when the legacy supplier was delivering that. So, you know, why, how and what are very simple words, but there's an immense amount of work behind that, and the detail that goes into that, don't underestimate, but I, you know, really do that. So the MOT was an early adopter. It's a great service. We're immensely proud of the work we've done with this. But the context I think is important here is DVSA deliver a service that's computer-based, digital, to 23,000 businesses, which are not ours. Most people, when they're doing digital transformation, are doing it to themselves within their own organisation control. This is different. 23,000 businesses. There are actually 80,000 registered users that we took through this transformation journey. Now, you know, they now will say that this service is a great service, but if we put, as James said, the users at the heart of this, you really can take those people on that journey. If you ignore them, then they will fight against you. We do 42 million tests a year. That is a high volume service. But if we move to the right hand side and talk about the finances, for DVSA as an organisation, this is £65 million worth of our revenue, so it's quite key to us. It's a service that funds itself, so this is a purely fee-funded service in government. There's no taxation that goes into this, so the industry that we serve pays for the service. More importantly, the data that we create helps enable electronic vehicle licensing and underpins the collection of £6.5 billion worth of sterling. So if we want to think about the criticality and the nervousness that if MOT starts to have a wobble or things, there's usually the phone ringing pretty quickly to James that we're getting in the way of delivering car tax. But if we then look at the 23,000 businesses that we provide these digital services to, they probably don't see the digital service as the key thing. As most businesses do, they see the potential of the revenue that can be created through MOT testing, and at a minimum, if we just take the core transaction of MOT, that's in excess of £1 billion of revenue. If we then build on top of that the vehicles that fail and the upside selling of repairs, we consider that to potentially be another £2 billion of revenue. Particularly that this is into the small and medium enterprise, it fits comfortably with the industrial strategy about creating entrepreneurship and revenue for small business. So yes, it's a digital service, but once we've launched that, it's much bigger and has a greater impact. So we have to get this right, and we have. Like all good services, we wanted to test, you know, where we are on that journey. So we have won a number of awards, particularly for IoT service management, how we support the managers. Particularly, something we're immensely proud of is our collaboration model that we have. But to put some numbers behind that, is we've done 400 releases since September 2015. Now, that can be quite a scary thing, or it can be a really positive thing. Those incremental changes that we're making on almost a weekly basis, and sometimes more often than that, are small changes that take those users on that smaller journey. So they're not seeing big changes, they're seeing a screen change, something move on screen, a little bit of extra functionality, rather than the old days where there'd been a big bang and a really big change management process behind it. So small and often allows people to adapt in a live environment. And you know, I'm pleased to say that 80,000 of those users respond really well to those small incremental changes. No service, no business survives without operating costs. You know, we have reduced our operating costs of this service by over 50%. So when we set off on the journey, one of the things that James didn't mention is our ambition was to deliver this significantly cheaper. What's really great is 50% reduction. And the next number down is when we were paying the legacy supplier, we paid them £1.05 in sterling for a transaction. So that's when we issued an MOT certificate and we pressed print, we paid £1.05. Today, DVSA deliver that service for 29p. So that gives you a scale of how we've reduced it. There's been some very aggressive work on hosting costs, driving down all the software costs, but what we haven't done is compromised investment in user experience. Having done that, we've made absolutely certain that all of the developments we've done, all of the experience we've built, those reusable learnings build into the next services. And what we have done on top of that, we've built an MOT history service, which is used around 5 million times a month, which is really good, more than we ever expected. And just recently we've launched our MOT reminder service, and we've a couple of 100,000 people subscribed to that. And again, when we look at did we do things in the right way, in Great Britain we have the Government Digital Service, who are looking across the whole of government, and we're pleased that when they came to review what we're doing, they concluded this is one of the best agile projects that they've seen. So I think with James building that cultural change and investing in digital, we've got a really solid basis to move on and deliver other services. So I'll move back to the service catalogue. And whenever I do any of the talks or webinars like this, one of the things we usually show and hold up is a service catalogue, which is an artifact, usually which is a piece of paper. It's not the catalogue at the end of it that's really important, it's the questions you ask yourself on that journey. So what is the service? And making sure that the service owners and the product managers in there really understand all the product detail, how that works. That says, how do we run the service? Traditionally, when you move from a legacy contract and you've got typical contract management things, is you're fetching everything in-house and you're responsible and accountable for all of those roles. So making sure that you've got that well-defined how you run the service is really important. And the third element to this is what will we measure to run and improve the service? There's more to keeping a digital service live and current than there is of just delivering transactions out to people. So moving on to the next bit is how we deal with our end-to-end improvement process. Is we spend time really recording, and anybody who's got an idea, whether it's James or our chief executive, the idea will be written down, recorded so that we can capture what that is. It's measured against a value matrix, then it goes into triage. If we then feel that that idea isn't going to move the service forward, isn't going to enhance user experience or drive down cost, then we'll get rid of the idea straight away. And there's a little bin picture there, but it's important that you don't carry things into the process that is going to distract and end up with a backlog that you're never going to achieve. So when we look at the value, as we're a government body, one of the key things is, does it help us deliver the policy outcome and that strategy and vision of making the road safer, journeys safer? We then look at the user value, is this really going to improve the user experience or make users join the service, get better transactions? And of course, we then look at the financial return on it. But it's 3 elements that we use in the value framework. Then we start talking about money and moving into the sort of discovery and developing it. And one of the things, as we took our business on the journey, and people generally know what a backlog is, but in the very early days when James joined us, backlog had that negative connotation of, oh, backlog must mean there's a delay. So we renamed it as the dynamic priority list, that people can understand it's a list of things we want to do that's dynamic. I'm pleased to say today we use the phrase backlog, but sometimes, you know, if you're using new ways of working, you have to find phrases that people are comfortable with and understand. So that's one of the things. Then we follow the journeys. Do we do discovery? We're really passionate about discovery. It's making sure that we actually get out to our frontline users, whether that be our internal staff, our driving examiners, or people in the garage. So we will find our users stood out in the garages seeing what's going on. Then, when we've implemented that and we've built the code or reuse something, is as we go into live stage, we make sure that we're constantly reviewing and constantly improving what we're doing. So it's not just a case of sticking code out there. It's important that when it's out there, we invest in it and make sure it keeps up to date. And as James mentioned, data analytics is really important, so I'm going to hand back to James, as this is something that we're both passionate about.
So we're starting to look at the data we've got in the agency and think about how we can exploit it a lot more effectively. And we recently did a pilot with our MOT data, and we looked at, could we correlate the MOT testers and the MOT garages and think about, were there MOT garages that were doing things that were unusual and potentially MOT testers that were doing things unusual. And through a fairly straightforward piece of machine learning, we identified someone in a garage that could do with an enforcement check. We visited that garage and we found there was unusual activity going on, and that garage is now going through an enforcement process. But it opened the way for us to start to think about our data in a different way. So could we start to use machine learning to look at the normal pattern of garage activity in an area, and then look for garages that fall outside of that area? And that might be, they might be passing too many vehicles or failing too many vehicles. There might be passing vehicles that have failed at another garage. They might be failing always on a certain item like windscreen wipers, or they might be failing certain types of vehicles. I mean, the list is endless. But with machine learning and machine ways of tackling things, we can ask the computer the questions and start to get the analytics back. And that should mean that whenever we want to send an enforcement person to a garage, it's because there's something unusual going on that needs a check and a look.
Okay. So one of the great things we did using data and analytics was word mining. So in our service desk, we had a number of calls that were coming in, and you know, like most early services, you know, there were high volumes of calls. So we did some analytics on our most common problems using word mining, and we found that one of the problems was about duplicate and replacement certificates, because motorists generally lose those. We fed that back into the service team. The service team made it much easier and an online service for that. And just from that very simple thing of using word mining, we dropped the volume of calls by 72% into our service centre, which again contributes to the reduced operating costs. So, you know, from machine learning to doing some very simple word analytics can deliver great value.
And again, on the roadside enforcement teams, they've now got smartphones, and we've built an app onto those smartphones, so they can just take a picture of the number plate of a heavy goods vehicle. It then brings up all the information about that lorry that we've got, whether it's been tested, any enforcement activity, any markers we've got on it for intelligence. But we can start to look at patterns of where that lorry's moved across the country using ANPR, and give additional information to the person on the roadside so they can take the right course of action and really start to inform our staff with what they can do with the data. And moving forwards, we've got a journey of digital transformation. So we've talked today a lot about MOT, which was the first service we took forwards. We've since gone live with another application, which is the vehicle operator licensing service. And now we've started the process for the next services. So we've completed a discovery for commercial vehicle testing and driver driver and rider and theory test, and we're now in the discovery for theory test. So we're going on this digital transformation journey for all our main services. We'll be using MOT as the blueprint. We've got that into a space we're comfortable with. It runs off a backlog. We're now putting up the backlogs of change against each of our services, and all our change now drives off these backlogs of change. We've got a common technology services backlog that covers all our technology change, and we've got a corporate backlog that covers anything to do with, say, HR and finance. But all the change that's coming into the digital services technology team is driven off our service backlogs, and those service backlogs are owned and maintained by service development groups that are chaired by service owners.
Okay. And finally, on the theory test, just to put some context of our ambition, is the theory test is the world's largest computerized based online test, and in Great Britain it caters for over 50% of the 16+ market. So we've got ambitions to create really new, innovative digital services, and our ambitions there, as if we can get that service where people in the future may be able to take that test at home.
And it's a learning journey for us. So as we move through this process across these different acronyms, which is MOT, commercial vehicles, theory test, driver and rider, then we're developing our Agile governance and we're evolving our Agile governance. So the Agile governance we're using today is definitely not the Agile governance we were using a couple of years ago. And we're now running a project to further simplify that governance so that we can get things through the process quicker with the minimum amount of governance, the minimum amount of documentation that still gives us the reliance we need. And as part of that, we split away an assurance team, a separate assurance team. So all the delivery capability sits within the digital and technology function. But we split out an Agile assurance function that sits within the finance function so that the board gets an independent view of our Agile approach.
Thank you very much, James and Alex. That was an amazing story in absolutely 30 minutes. So we are bang on time. And already the questions are starting to pile up. So if we are good to go, I can go with the first one.
Yeah.
So how hard was it to convince an executive level support and staff, particularly enforcement, which you have, to try the new ways of working?
So within the UK government, there's a body called the Government Digital Service, and they had already seen the power of Agile and Agile ways of working, and we were able to build on what they were already asking organisations to do. They had already recognised that for software development in particular, and these types of transformation projects, an Agile iterative approach was a good way to go. Moving away from procuring on a fixed price, fixed scope type of project. But it was still a journey for us with the board and with the directors, and making sure that every step of the way they understood that the value we were delivering was absolutely critical to us, that we could show value delivered by Agile. And even today, MOT gets its money released in 6 monthly blocks, and we say which epics are we going to deliver in those 6 months. And every month there's a report that goes back to the board to show how we're building those epics across that delivery pipeline. At the end of the 6 months, we present back to the board on what we've done, and then we release the next 6 months worth of funding. And it's a model that we're using for other deliveries as well. So we're very open with the board and with the executive team, and we report regularly up to what they're doing. We also make use of Yammer, so we have Yammer in the organisation, and we have a very open policy on using Yammer for reporting these types of projects. So we're currently running an alpha stage for the commercial vehicle services, and it puts up its show and tell presentation every 2 weeks onto Yammer, so anyone in the organisation can see where that project's at and what it's doing. So there's an open policy with everyone in the organisation and specific reporting on the value delivered to the board, and that value delivered is independently assured by that team that I said that sits in finance.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we have another question from Mark. He's in the US. The question is, what's a potential downside to Agile ways of working within a government organization?
I don't think there's a downside to it. I think if you believe it's the right thing to do, then it's about helping people on that journey and taking them. So very much like I said, don't use the word backlog if people feel uncomfortable with that, and we use dynamic priority list, is one, is using the right language so people can understand. I think that there's always a hesitancy in some of the more traditional departments, such as finance, that they want certainty on delivery. They want to know, that you've got a guaranteed outcome, that you've specified things, there's a scope. Well, that didn't work in the old days when you had a specified scope, because projects used to go wrong. So it's about taking those people on that journey. I think today we will still wrestle with people who've got that old mindset that want absolute guarantees, fixed deliverables. It's the wrong thing to do. Time changes. So I don't think it's a downside. I think it can be challenging in certain areas, and if you believe it's the right thing and you stay consistent, I think you'll take people on that journey.
And just on top of that, just my question is it, are you using Agile everywhere, or you're using both at some points, Agile and
Clearly,
waterfall?
we use both. So an example on theory test where we're doing the next phase of work, the digital element of it is Agile, following the standard thing that people recognise. But where we're looking at some of the more traditional market capability in the commercial space, that's following a waterfall project, because it has to be visible to everybody. So you can have a project with actually two elements in it, and I think you have to blend those two together. Agile is not the answer for everything. Equally, neither is waterfall. So we have a live project where we're using both methodologies.
Perfect. The another question is, how did you convince procurement to adapt Agile contracting and procurement with the market? So I guess this goes back to your delivery partner model that you are so innovative around it in the UK, at least.
Yeah, so we wanted to put in some digital partners, and we went so that we knew there was an amount of work coming through our Agile projects, and instead of re-procuring every piece of Agile work, we wanted to put in place a digital partner panel that we could allocate the work to. So we went out for procurement, working hand in hand with procurement. We awarded to 5 digital partners, and then we allocate the work across the digital partners now moving forwards. It's something we've done working with procurement, and in terms of procurement working with us on an Agile approach, it was around to showing the value of what Agile gives us and the flexibility it gives us. So the contracts we're running under Agile with our development partners, they're on a month's notice. So we know that if they aren't performing at the level we need, we're able to switch them out and put a different vendor in. Whereas under the old contracts we were letting, they were 10-year outsourced contracts, so they were much more complicated and much more heavier governance to keep those working.
I think the advantage of the 5 digital partners working in this new way of working is, once the organisation decide they want to do a project, is we're almost instantly to be able to allocate that work, and in less than a fortnight we can have people on the ground delivering at space. So in the traditional thing, there could have been an approval of a business case, 3 months for a classic procurement model or longer. So that 5 partner allows us to hit the ground running, and the team of people that were selected, and it's working really well.
Amazing. That's I know from the market that this is something that many government organizations are looking for, and so that's very good. So we have another question from David, and the question is, what was the biggest challenge when building large in-house capability over the legacy contract management style that you had in the past?
Yeah, the biggest challenge that I see is building the capability and bringing the people into the organisation, and then building that cultural difference around how we're going to work in a different way. So we've tackled that in several ways. We created the space. We built a purpose-built Agile development suite of around 100 seats with U-shaped design and whiteboards around, and a lot of interactive screening. And then we looked at bringing some experienced people across into that team, and we've employed some graduates into that team. In another part of our organisation, we're building the mobile apps, we've brought apprentices in. So we've looked at different ways of bringing the capability and building that in. But then it's also about embracing the cultural change and the cultural shift to work in an Agile way. So we work with the vendor partners. We blend those teams in with our own staff. So we're building that the cultural enablement between our teams, seeing how our vendors work. and slowly building that journey and that story and shift of mindset.
And I think the cultural change is one of the biggest challenges. And traditionally people would look at the government and the civil service as an unexciting place to work. So as part of building that, all of the people on the service industry, we put them through the 2-day VFQ course. What that does is create a common language, a little bit of excitement for the team because they're seeing different ways of working, and it's, you know, that change from what people would typically see as civil servants, you know, doing unexciting work, to work in an area which is really dynamic and delivering, you know, great value, attracts people. So what is really good is the graduate program is all of those graduates have stayed with us. The apprentices that we're growing, they're attracting new people to come and work for us. So, you know, it's not an overnight thing. And I think both myself and James are working very hard at building that team, but it is a place where people want to come and work. And that is all about changing the environment and culture.
I guess it wasn't a very easy journey, was it?
But I think if in any organisation that's moved from a typical contract-based role where the supplier has done everything and you're fetching that in-house, one, that's quite scary. I think secondly, we're recruiting, particularly in digital, roles that didn't exist previously. We're creating career opportunities for people. People are allowed to move through the organisation. So I think there's no one single answer for how you do it, but I think what's really important is you help grow your own people.
So another question from Tom is, how did you manage the architectural designs whilst delivering Agile?
Yeah, so building an internal architectural capability was key to our success moving forwards, because historically most of our architecture, or most of those decisions, have been made by our outsourced partners, quite rightly under the kind of contracts that we had in place. So we built an architectural capability and then we split that down into different architectural domains. So we have a business architecture domain, a technology architecture domain, a data architecture domain, security architecture domain, and we put in place a governance process that works across the project. So the projects have got embedded architects. As they want to make decisions, they can convene a solutions design board, and that solutions design board will review the architectural requirements and the architectural decisions that are needed to be made by that project. They can be convened fairly quickly, so they're not on a time frame, but so it enables projects to keep moving. But if there's a big architectural decision, or a major architectural decision, like a decision on a new piece of software or a new piece of technology, or some change to the way in which we've architected our services, it goes to what we call the architecture review board. And as the director of the department, the directorate, I chair that, and that will look at and approve major architectural decisions. So we've broken it down to say big architectural decisions comes to a review board, and then solution design boards or peer reviews will make the decisions for the project by project decision-making process. But you're absolutely right, we've had to build that architectural capability in-house. We also put in place architecture as a service, so we're able to bring architects in on a service contract to enable us to bring architects in and out quickly to meet our demands. Being in the civil service, with some of the pay scales of the civil service, there are some roles which are challenging to get, and experienced architects is one of those, although we're currently now working with colleagues at the Department for Transport about how we might be able to increase pay for some of those critical roles.
Great. And just to go to the last questions. Last question is, I guess, is the what are the key lessons from the journey so far?
So I think one of the key lessons is you have to be ambitious. If you're going to set off on a journey like this, is you have to really be ambitious because you're going into new territories. It's difficult. So if you haven't got that ambition drive, I think one of the lessons we learned is there's never enough time. I think when we're moving out of legacy contracts, those contract dates are always relatively hard. So, you know, the lesson for us is really be conscious of what those critical milestones are, that the immovable things. The biggest lesson for us is about designing the services and taking the whole team through that end-to-end service design. It's their service, and both myself and you are going to make sure that the business own the services. We do digital, but if it's owned by those service managers and his team. And then the other thing I learned is resilience. As you go on this journey, what we have learned is not everybody who starts it comes to the end, and that's unfortunate, but what you can't do is carry people who are not with the agenda. So if they're not with the agenda, then you have to make some pretty tough decisions, you know. And you know, we've said goodbye to some very good colleagues, but this is tough and it's not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, building on that, for me, is the recognition you're not going to get it all right. So you are going to get things wrong along the way. I think what's really important on that journey and that way of working is that you keep the executive and the board updated. And if something isn't going the way you expect it to go, that they know early, and we're completely honest and transparent with what's needed to be done to fix it and what decisions need to be made, and the need that things are going to need to change, and you're going to need to iterate the ways of working. So going back to how we started, our agile ways of working are definitely different to now. The way we report to the board is different to how it was a couple of years ago, and as we scale up, our thinking about how we might work going forwards is changing. So nothing is fixed in terms of governance now. We can change it and move it forward as long as we keep getting the assurance we need.
Perfect, and that leads us to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you,
for
everybody.
taking the time, and good luck.
Good night.